who can't attend can get the benefit of the seminar. Okay, so keep your mics on mute during the session. Probably the best way to deal with questions is to enter them in chat. Lisa, will we have time at the end for Q&A?
Yeah, definitely.
We will have time for Q&A. So if you put them in there, that gives the speakers advance warning and they can respond to them and then add any other questions. Okay. Presentations will be shared afterwards, so you needn't take copious notes. So is that it for housekeeping, Lisa?
Could I just chip in, Andrew, if that's okay? It's Helen Onions. Apologies, I can only stay for an hour today, but if there's anything from the Q&A, in terms of the Domestic Abuse Local Partnership Board, which I support, Lisa can bring that back for the board.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. Okay, cheers. Okay, well, we have 3 speakers today from the police, from health, and from Cranston, which is the new provider of domestic abuse services. Craig Newey, Detective Inspector Craig Newey, will be speaking and talk about the MARIC process, the role of domestic abuse risk officers and players law. Then Paul Cooper from the Integrated Care Board will talk about domestic homicide reviews. And then finally, our new domestic abuse service provider, Cranston, who is represented by Don Jones, will finish by highlighting key warning flags to look out for when working with possible victims of domestic abuse, talk a little about their service and how to refer in. So we are going to start now. 53 attendees. Excellent to see so many people from so many different organisations. So great pleasure to introduce and welcome to Telford Safeguarding World, our new Detective Inspector Craig Newey. Craig, over to you.
Good afternoon all. Already introduced Craig Newey, Detective Inspector for Vulnerability at Mallinsgate Police Station. So I've got responsibility within Telford and Wrekin local policing area for high-risk domestic abuse, including rape and sexual offences, also child protection, and on top of that, and very sadly, I've got quite a heavy footprint on child deaths that occur in the area and support the coroner in relation to those. So a couple of areas that I've got to touch upon today. It will be fairly whistle stop, and thank you, Lisa, for sending through the link from the previous input on these areas back in June. Those that did see those inputs back in June, there have been some changes, so hopefully there's something for everybody in relation to what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to start with trying to share my screen. Has that worked?
Perfect.
Yep.
Wonderful. So we're going to talk about the role of the DARO. So this is domestic abuse risk officers. I was very keen for this to be focused on the actual DAROs themselves, rather than just talk a very corporate sort of role profile. And that's why the first screen is to highlight the individuals that form my team of domestic abuse risk officers. So we've currently got Louise Armstrong and Natasha Davis as full-time DAROs, and Jess Willits will be job sharing with Stuart Platt. So Stuart Platt will be our first and only male DARO, which post-vetting gives us that brevity across the office. It provides victims with options and the capability to support people across all genders. It's very relevant and representative for me as well, because as chair of MARIC for Telford and Wrekin currently, last month I heard 14 cases, and 3 of those did relate to male victims of high-risk domestic abuse. So it's very relevant that we get Stu in as quickly as possible, fully staff our team of DAROs, because the work that they do is really significant. And we can obviously provide that brevity across all of our victims in the area. So DAROs, the role of a DARO is to safeguard and support high-risk victims of domestic abuse, their children and families. Each domestic incident where police officers attended is graded as standard, medium or high, depending on the information provided within the DARA. This is where there is some relevance and difference from the last input. The police now use DARA instead of DASH. Lots of our partners on the meeting will continue to use DASH in terms of how they grade their victims and service providers or service users. And they will continue to feed into the MARAC process via DASH as well. Policing, we've now moved to the DARA process off the back of a recommendation by, it was Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabularies at the time, and this has been implemented through the College of Policing now. For me, coming into this area and really scrutinising how work was coming into my office, I was seeing that within policing, people using perhaps the DASH as more of a tick box exercise, which I didn't like, so I'm glad of the change for DARA. DARA gives us more qualitative value. It reduces the questions down to 18, whereas DASH is 24, and it's designed to elicit more information from the victim as well. And from my perspective, in terms of making sure policing is delivering what it needs to deliver, it should provoke more professional curiosity, professional judgment. There should be stronger rationales and decision making in-house as we embed the DARA process. It's then the job of the DARO to complete further risk assessments on high-risk victims. We fully check our systems. Contact is always made with the victim, or they're visited in person, where more information will be gathered regarding the situations and the incident, and then the relevant safeguarding measures are implemented to try and prevent further incidents and keep them safe. And that's why I'm fully supportive of the DAROs actually going out to high-risk domestic abuse victims, so we can look at that safeguarding, and we've got eyes on where we can make improvements and keep people safe moving forwards. Safeguarding measures that the DAROs adopt. Gas warnings on police systems. So a gas warning means gazetteer warning. It's how we identify premises where we can mark up our incident logs that should a call come in from that particular address, it is treated as high risk, and the relevant risks around that particular address are highlighted immediately to police, so we can respond accordingly. They also support non-molestation order referrals, as well as the creation of risk management plans. The DAROs are really critical in terms of how those are driven along and how we use our colleagues across policing to support visits and really relevant updates, and so we can monitor any change in risk to victims. They refer into MARAC as well, which will be the next input. They provide advice to victims around safeguarding and apps such as HighlyGuard and Bright Sky, advice to the victims around personal safety. The DAROs are critical in making the necessary referrals to partner agencies, our third sector organisations and charitable organisations as well. They will also seek refuge accommodation for the victim and the children, and on occasion have actually, as part of that real wraparound support for victims, have transported victims to refuges to settle them in and introduce them to the right people to make people feel safe. They will arrange the installation of monitoring alarms and DOCO security referral. So a DOCO is a design out crime officer. They will actually go to addresses and they will look at where we can put on tamper locks. We can look at whether we need to embed fireproof letterboxes and speak to our colleagues within the fire service. So they're real critical in terms of how we make sure that we are preventing further offences from occurring. On occasions, mobile phones are purchased and given to victims. That's very relevant actually, because we had to do that for a victim of stalking on Friday just gone. So that's a very relevant update there. And we'll signpost victims and families to food banks and crisis support as well. So they are very, very key to my office. Although we mainly focus on high-risk victims, we do also provide support for victims that have been assessed as medium. We will ask the DAROs to speak with the victim to provide support and options available to them. It means that sometimes, I've touched upon it, we can fluctuate our risk management plans between medium, high standard as we address emerging threat, basically. Ongoing support's provided to victims who are in the MARIC process and on risk management plans. Really, the pertinent bits from this are safer neighbourhood teams and the DAROs liaise together to make sure the RMP is fully serviced, so that victims have a visible presence. They are seen, they are monitored by officers that are very au fait with that geographical area and know the risks to that particular victim. Victims may also ask DAROs about court processes, where we can arrange court visits so that people have familiarisation days at court before they actually go into that environment, because it can be incredibly daunting. It's daunting for police officers as well as victims and witnesses. The DARO works closely with partner agencies such as Social Services, Family Connect, Probation, Women's Aid, and now Cranston and any other agency. This is done via regular contact. And finally, DARO is often asked by our patrol officers to visit victims of domestic abuse who failed to provide statements, and trying to encourage them to do so and support their safeguarding. We find a lot of our suspects who are arrested for domestic abuse offences are very reticent to provide testimony, and that touch from a DARO rather than a uniformed officer sometimes is to explain what we can do, how we can support them moving forwards, what measures we can embed to sort of reduce risks so that people will engage and support a criminal justice outcome. They're critical to doing that. A DARO will also administer Clare Laws application, which is domestic violence disclosure scheme, which is something I'll come on to shortly. And they also provide my own officers within PVP, but that's protecting vulnerable people, with information that assist our investigations, because they continue to maintain that contact with our victims as well as the officer in the case doing so also. So that is the first input. Are we leaving questions to the end, did we say?
Yeah, we will, Craig. If people type them in, and then when we get to the end, we'll have a roundup with all three speakers.
Okay, wonderful. Next input, can everybody see the MARIC sort of PowerPoint opening?
Yes.
Perfect. So MARIC is a multi-agency risk assessment conference. Within my office, I've got a dedicated MARIC coordinator in Judith McPherson, who is the guru of all things MARIC, and has assisted me no end in this this PowerPoint presentation. So some stats there. I don't propose to go through all of them because I'm quite conscious of the time that we're eating into, and everybody's going to get this input afterwards. But it just underpins why we needed to have a multi-agency risk assessment conference embedded across all of the policing areas within West Mercia. So what is MARIC doing? So MARIC deals with high-risk serious cases of domestic abuse. This process is obviously victim-led. All agencies involved in any way with domestic abuse are represented. The conference facilitates, monitors and evaluates information from all sources and uses that information to increase the safety of health and well-being of victims, both adults and children, determine if the offender poses significant risk to individuals or the general public, provide a risk management plan providing professional support to the persons at risk, provide support and advice for victims in dealing with all aspects of domestic abuse, including support within the justice system. It is intended that the conferences and their agreed actions will reduce repeat victimisation, help to protect the victim and any children, increase the number of perpetrators brought to justice, and identify those suitable for referral into Domestic Abuse Perpetrator Panel, DAP, which I'm not going to steal Cranston's thunder. I think they're up third today. Improve agency accountability and increase the support of all staff involved in high-risk domestic abuse cases. The assistance process, this is about where we can signpost into, and also people that can refer into MARIC themselves as well. And that's just to touch upon how many organisations, charities, third sector workers are out there that can support victims and be involved in the MARIC process. So the MARIC referral form, touched up on it now, DASH versus DARA. So for MARIC, our partners will continue to complete the DASH form until such time as they see fit to change, if they do so at all. The change to DARA is compulsory for policing only. It hasn't been rolled out to our partners as yet. It's something that we need to embed, monitor, and make sure that it's delivering what it's aimed to do. So, personally, in-house, I have removed the DASH from our referral forms. It streamlines the work for the DAROs. It means that we can disseminate our referrals to partners at the same time, where we've seen inefficiencies previously, where we're sending separate forms to Women's Aid and separate forms to Drive. So hopefully that streamlines that process. And MARIC now obviously feeds into domestic abuse perpetrator panel. So we've touched upon the amount of people around the table that are there representing everything from probation, health, ISVA, IDVA, the list goes on, but we've now got representatives from Drive, our partners, that can identify suitable perpetrators that can be worked with to implement diversionary and educational pathways to try and stem offending and bring about behavioural change. So in conclusion, MARIC was an important innovation in the community and criminal justice system in response to domestic abuse. The multiple and unique needs of the victim and their children are recognised in this type of multi-agency approach. Representatives from many agencies are undertaking substantially more work and hope that their actions will lead to reductions in victimisation as well as homicide prevention. And a couple of stats there. Telford and Wrekin MARIC has heard 3,687 cases to date since it started in February 2008. And in the last 12 months, Telford and Wrekin MARIC has heard 260 cases involving 298 children. It does fluctuate significantly in Telford, for those that are interested really, about how things, the disparity in month on month. So last month I heard 14 cases. This month, because of the way it falls, it's a 5-week month, but it's jumped significantly to 26. I've spoken to certain partners where they've almost not questioned, but wondered why we have so many high cases in Telford. And rather than it be of significant concern in terms of how many cases we hear at MARIC, I think fundamentally it's because we've got our referral pathways right. So at MARIC this month, we have got referrals into MARIC from 8 different sources. So from within the police, outside police forces such as West Midlands, Wales, ISVA, IDVA, probation, health, well-being, and then there's also MARIC to MARIC referrals. So whilst it seems a significant amount, I think within Telford and Wrekin, I think that's quite a strong point that we appear to have our referral mechanisms and pathways right. There's some help there for West Mercia Women's Aid, who are integral to the MARIC process, National Helpline DV Assist, and there are also contact details there for Judith, as well as my contact details being on the other 2 inputs that have been will take place. So that is MARIC, and I will now move on finally to DVDS. Can I just double check that's gone on the screen? Fantastic. Okay, Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, Clare's Law, a key piece of work that I would like to see more and more referrals come my way as the authorising officer for this piece of work. So background history, Clare's Law Scheme was set up after Claire Wood was murdered by her boyfriend in February 2009. Claire was strangled and set on fire at a home in Salford, Greater Manchester by George Appleton, who had a record of violence against women. Claire's father, Michael Brown, who campaigned for the introduction of the legislation, remains convinced she would still be alive had she known the full extent of Appleton's previous behaviour. So the aim of the scheme is to give the public a formal mechanism to make inquiries about a partner if they're worried that they may have been abusive in the past. If police checks identify that a partner has a record of abusive behaviour, or there is information to indicate that the applicant or vulnerable party may be at risk, the police will consider sharing this information with them. disclose the information if it's lawful, necessary and proportionate to do so in the interest of protecting them or their children from harm. There's two key words there: applicant, vulnerable party. So you don't have to be in the relationship to be making the application around Clare's Law, which is really key in identifying persons that may not understand the risk that they might be in, but that sort of outside pair of eyes from a friend or family member may really be sort of concerned for a loved one. The scheme aims to help the public make a more informed decision on whether they continue a relationship, and that's really critical in the post-disclosure sort of process. There are two methods to DVDS Clare's Laws applications. There's the right to ask and the right to know. The right to ask is anyone can make an application about a partner. They do not have to have specific reasons or concerns. Any relevant third party, such as a parent, neighbour or friend, can also make an application if they're concerned. A third party referral the applicant would not necessarily receive the information about the partner. The information will only be given to somebody who's in a position to use the information to protect themselves or the potential victim or children from abuse. The police will take details of what prompted the inquiry once somebody makes an application. The relationship between the applicant, vulnerable party and the subject of the application. We interrogate all our police systems on the information provided and conduct an initial risk assessment. If the applicant provides information which amounts to a crime, then this is recorded and allocated appropriately. If the records show that an individual may be at risk of domestic abuse from partner or ex-partner, the police will consider disclosing the information. And that's also key. There are sometimes delays in right to ask because we undertake what's called police national database checks. The police national database was brought in following the Soham murders, where Ian Huntley was known in other force areas, but that information wasn't accessible to Cambridgeshire Police on their own internal systems. I am very reticent to sign off on Clare's Laws applications until we have conducted those police national database checks, so we can ensure that we've got a full understanding of that individual, and we can understand where there may be transferred risk should that individual leave a relationship and move back to their originating sort of force area as well. The right to know enables the police to make a disclosure on their own initiative if they receive information about the violent or abusive behaviour of a person that may impact on the safety of that person's current or ex-partner. The right to know is key to us and it enables us to respond really swiftly rather than having to go through those more sort of prolonged checks that come with a right to ask. This could be information arising from criminal investigation, through statutory or third sector agency involvement, or from another source of police and intelligence. The police and other relevant partner agencies will offer assistance to the potential victim in creating a safety plan and provide help and support. So this is where, for the partners on the screen, if you're a professional and you receive a disclosure, please look at making a referral yourself rather than telling that person to make a referral of their own accord. This way you can ensure that it's been requested. We have examples where people have disclosed as service users to people, key workers that they're working with, that they're concerned that they've got into a relationship with somebody who may have a previous history of domestic abuse, and they've been advised to make that disclosure or apply for a right to ask of their own accord. Ultimately, then that person fails to do so because they've already disclosed it to who they deem in a position of trust for them. And if that report never comes, then we haven't responded collectively to that potential risk. A right to know also expedites the process, because if you apply as a professional, the identification checks do not need to be made because you're coming through on professional emails with relevant contact numbers, reduces the time for the process significantly, and it becomes a right to know, even though initially a disclosure from the service user would have been a right to ask that may have never came. The right to know process from professional referral is streamlined by having ready access to the information held in the systems. For example, social workers have access to protocol and to police systems via the Harm Assessment Unit, NHS, IDVA, ISVA. Instead of depending on a client coming to police, put that professional referral in on their behalf with the information that's triggered that safeguarding issue. We can't unknow what we know, and if that person fails to submit a right to ask and is subjected to serious harm or even a domestic homicide, then these opportunities to intervene will rightly be scrutinised. So that's really the main thing for our partners on the screen today to take away really from the Clare's Law process. Within both processes, the person disclosed to are told not to share the information with anybody else unless they've spoken to the police or the person who gave them the information and they've agreed that it can be shared. Be aware that the assessment criteria that myself and the sergeants use once receiving the information about the report about the subject, despite holding information that you may deem as a referring authority may feel needs to be disclosed, may not necessarily reach the threshold criteria for disclosure. It must comply with case law as well as data protection and human rights legislation, and it must be reasonably proportionate for us to make the disclosure based on the credible risk of violence or harm. There's a couple of bits of myth busting here. So if a person is no longer in a relationship and has no intention of rekindling that relationship, it does not fit the criteria. They must be in a relationship for a DVDS to be disclosed. If a person is being harassed by a partner or ex-partner and they have suffered domestic violence with, then this needs to be reported as a substantive criminal offence rather than a DVDS. If a person is on an on-off relationship, which is not in terms of concurrent years, but in a cycle of abuse, then the whole premise of rekindling a lot can fit the criteria of that relationship. If a person is in a very long-term relationship, has a lot of reported domestic violence, emotional, physical abuse, subject to MARAC, is under social services or subject to a risk management plan, then they will be fully aware of the domestic abuse behaviours of that subject. They will know what that person is capable of, and therefore a DVDS disclosure will have minimal impact and could be considered an abusive process because the vulnerable party has enough information to make the decision to leave and safeguard themselves and any dependents, supported by the DARO and the police, of course. Process for the decision in these cases is very dependent on the individual case history, but if it's believed that a vulnerable party will benefit and firmly believes the abuser has never done this before, then please seek advice from the Police Protecting Vulnerable People Department. There could also be extenuating circumstances such as the person has learning or difficulties or disabilities, mental health, severe physical disabilities, which may alter the understanding of what's happening to them. We've had a couple of cases in here within the last couple of months where vulnerable people or vulnerable parties have buried their head in the sand, do not want to accept that the person that they've now fallen in love with has that capability to commit domestic violence offences against them. And by engaging with the applicant, who in one of the cases was the mother of the vulnerable party, supported by a DARO, having had that police involvement through my team, they've now had it explained to them in a way that they can understand that the risk that they're in to make an informed decision about whether they want to continue with that relationship. If the applicant, vulnerable party, is subject to child in need or child protection plans, have attended child protection meetings, our child protection officers who attend these meetings will give very detailed information with regards to both domestic abuse and child sex offences in that forum. And therefore, a DVDS or a child sexual offences disclosure scheme is not necessary, as they will receive more information in that setting than will be given on as part of the disclosure. And then this is just a question mark as to whether DVDS is the correct pathway, or we need to look at Sarah's law, which is the child sexual offences disclosure scheme. If there are child safeguarding issues or concerns of a sexual nature, please consider a Sarah's law rather than a DVDS, because the applicant and vulnerable party does not need to be in a relationship for us to make disclosures. If a CSODS, child sexual offences disclosure scheme, has been applied for and no sexual offences have been highlighted but violent offences have, well, then we can still provide a disclosure on those offences because it's for safeguarding purposes. And it's back to that sort of, you can't know what you know. Once we're in receipt of that information, once we have it, we must be proactive and robust about delivering it. Please look at the best process for the purpose. This is around people applying for both DVDSs and CSODs at the same time, because once a respective force has determined the best process, one of those requests has to be terminated. This has caused problems and confusion in the past with applicants and vulnerable parties believing that they're going to get two separate disclosures, and we need to manage that expectation in such a sensitive area of crime. And again, when researching CSODs, we will look at violent offences, and should domestic violence be highlighted, we will look at the necessity to disclose alongside any sexual offences. The right to know process is the same for CSODs, where we will make a professional referral and we will expedite that because it's beneficial and it's critically around the safeguarding of a child. On there, I've put the link to the domestic violence disclosure scheme via the Home Office, which is the document. It's only 20 odd pages long, so it's not really one of those that's going to bore people to death. And there's some really useful information in there about the referral process and right to ask and right to know. The contacts in our office, PSI Julie Norris is my SPOC for all things DVDS and CSODs. So if there are any questions around this process, then please call us. I would much rather be inundated with CSODs and Claire's law applications than not see them come through the door and us not mitigate that risk and give people the opportunity to understand whether they're at risk, to make informed decisions about whether they continue with the relationships. And that is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Excellent. You apex your time, but you've got an enormous amount in. Thank you very much for that. I noticed there's one question on the chat already. If people have further questions before the end of the session, if they can put them on there for Craig. But at the end, we'll come back, Craig, if there are any specific ones that people don't want to put on the chat. So again, thank you very much. And moving on then to our second speaker, Paul Cooper from the ICB. Who's going to talk about domestic homicide reviews. Paul.
Hello, thank you, everyone. I hope I've already started sharing my slides. Is that correct? Can you see them?
Yes, we can see them.
Lovely. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I'm going to talk to you specifically about the domestic homicide review process and also what that tells us about something specific relating to suicide, which not everyone will be aware of. It's very similar to the presentation I did in June.
Paul,
but
can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sorry. So good afternoon. My name is Paul Cooper. I'm the lead for adult safeguarding at Shropshire Telford and Wrekin Integrated Care Board. So I'm going to talk to you, as I say, about domestic homicides and suspected victim suicides. If you see by the title of my presentation, if you loved me, you take the tablets. I want you to think about that throughout what I'm going to say to you. A very experienced domestic abuse worker, and when I was talking to her about suicides and domestic abuse, was said, "Oh my God, I'm working with someone currently," and this is what her partner said to her very chillingly at the last meeting. So just think about that sentence as we're going along and what that tells us about the dynamic of domestic abuse and the elements of coercive and controlling behaviour that goes with it. So if I can move us on, I am going to share with you something that was stated by a relative who lost a loved one. Can I just ask you to take a second to read that, please? Okay, so I think that sort of grounds us in terms of what we're exactly talking about, in terms of the importance of the subject. And if I could give you one key message, particularly if you're a frontline worker or you're supporting frontline workers, is to very much focus on that really telling comment about we need to ask the right questions. And if we ask the right questions, that's when we can start to understand. My practice goes back 30 years, and I can remember undertaking domestic abuse training from really, really eminent people in the field. And they used to say, the figures would always be different. Research shows us that it takes 32 incidents before somebody is willing to come forward to confront the domestic abuse that they're facing and seek help, or it takes 47, or whatever the number. That was always a key tenet, that people have to be abused for a long time before they're willing to accept the need for change. And really, that was a nonsense. And we didn't always understand that was a nonsense. The key to actually accepting help is someone asking the right question. So that's really important and can be very powerful in terms of the work that you do. By asking a question, you can start a process. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be asking ourselves some questions. So do agencies understand the domestic homicide review criteria? Do all staff understand the risk of suicide in relation to domestic abuse? And is there any information from research out there that will help us become more effective, more knowledgeable, and therefore more helpful about what we do? So let me just recap what a domestic homicide review is. So a domestic homicide review is defined by statute, and it means a review into the circumstances in which the person age 16 or over has or appears has died, and that death appears to be related to the following: violence, abuse, or neglect by a person to whom he was related or with whom he was or had been in an intimate personal relationship, or a member of the same household as himself. And it is held with a view to identifying the lessons to be learned from that death. So domestic homicide reviews governed by statute. It's when somebody dies and there appears to be that they died from violence, abuse, and neglect, and they had a personal relationship with that person. So it can be people living together, hence same household members, an intimate personal relationship, i.e. partners or family members as well. But the guidance goes on to say this, and this is the only reference in the statutory guidance about domestic homicide reviews pertaining to suicide. So I will read it out, so forgive me if that's a bit tedious. Where a victim took their own life, suicide, and the circumstances give rise to a concern, for example, it emerges that there was coercive controlling behaviour in the relationship, a review should be undertaken. Even if a suspect is not charged with an offence or they are tried and acquitted, reviews are not about who is culpable. So does everybody understand, first of all, the risk of suicide as the consequence of living with the experience of domestic abuse, and that equally such experiences where someone then goes on to take their own life, they should also be considered for domestic homicide reviews. So that's something that, again, that's important to hold on to. And as I say, this is from the statutory guidance. So in 2021, we had the Domestic Abuse Act. There's been various pieces of statute over the years that informs our understanding of domestic abuse, but we had a dedicated act in 2021. And this is what the statutory guidance to the Domestic Abuse Act tells us. So it notes that the psychological impact of domestic abuse is severe and can lead people to suicidal ideation, so thinking about suicide, and it can also lead some people to attempting suicide. I think it could have gone stronger and says we actually know there's very clear evidence that as a consequence of domestic abuse, people kill themselves, and that's killing themselves every day. And interestingly, 11% of male and 7% of female victims of partner abuse attempted suicide in the previous year, and that 39 suicides were linked to domestic abuse in 2021. I'll talk a little bit more about research in a minute. And then the National Refuge Organisation stated that 24% of the victims, so a quarter of the people they work with, feel suicidal. 18% had plans, 3% made attempts. And again, we talk about trauma-informed care today, and we have a better understanding of what that means. But people who have suffered domestic abuse can have lifelong trauma-related issues, and there's a need to understand that when we're dealing with people and recognizing the difficulties that they may face. So the research, well, actually, we've really benefited from the last 2 years of research undertaken by the Vulnerability Knowledge and Practice Programme. So basically, for those of us who weren't familiar with this organisation, it is effectively the research and development arm of national policing. So they work very closely with the National Chief Police Council and the College of Policing, and they have done some incredibly detailed and I think groundbreaking research into the issues of domestic abuse and homicide. So it's important that we use these documents to actually inform practice. So there's the links to year 1 and year 2 of the research. And in that research, they looked at every single domestic homicide case in England and Wales. So they've got really definitive data. And so what they've told us from that is from those 2 years, from 20 to 21 and 21 to 22, there were 470 deaths that were determined to be domestic homicide related. Interestingly, 202 of these were intimate partner homicides. So that is when one partner in a relationship killed the other, and that also includes ex-partners. And very significantly, a person is at greatest risk of domestic abuse, of domestic homicide, when they are trying to end the relationship, when they've left that person. So I think that tells us something really significant about managing risks. Of those 470 deaths, 103 of them were adult family member homicides. So a relative other than a husband and wife or a boyfriend, girlfriend, if I can use that term. They were homicides where it was siblings or more typically parent to adult child or adult child to their parent. And there's 103 of those. But just to focus on this for a second, in that figure, there were 114 suicides following domestic abuse. And breaking that down further, 97 people who took their own life were women and 17 were men. And quite interestingly, the research says that there was no discernible impact of COVID. So bearing in mind that lockdown happened on the 23rd of March 2020, they said there was no discernible impact on homicide rates. Certainly there's been lots of information out there about lockdown putting greater pressure on couples where there was violence already taking part and the violent partner was becoming more violent. But that doesn't correlate with changes in domestic homicide rates. So some other key data, which we'll just go through very quickly. The methods of all deaths, 28% were knives, 21% was strangulation or hanging. Hanging is in the case of where it is a suicide. 10% is poison, 10% is other, not known, which again, we should know. 6% were kicking and punches, 6% blunt force, shootings were 2%, and then there was another figure relating to those cases where we're not knowing. Locations of death, 90% happened in urban areas, 10% in rural areas. There's been some research looking at domestic abuse in rural areas for those of you who are working in a rural area. And what it says is domestic abuse lasts longer before people come forward for help. And then it is also harder to impact on change because of some resource and cultural issues about that. And then 66% happen in the home, 9% happen outdoors, 9% of the people died in hospital, but that was injuries because they sustained elsewhere. And then the gender of the suspects. So 83% of the perpetrators are male and 17% female. I don't know if that cuts across any other data you've seen, or your own estimations or your own thinking about it, but that is the most definitive data, the most reliable data we've got. There's been absolute clarity as to all of those cases, and the researchers know every single case intimately. So I think that's very reliable. And then gender of victims, 70% are female and 30% are male. So again, I don't know if that busts any myths for people about their understanding of that issue. So in terms of the intimate partner homicides, the gender breakdown is 83% female, 70% male. Family member homicides, so when a relative other than a husband and wife have been killed, the breakdown is rather interesting. 47% of those who died are female and 53% are male. And for suspected victim suicides, the gender balance there is 85% are women and 15% are men. And there's the ethnicity figures as well, which is broadly in line with population trends. So that's something to think about as well. So what are the critical risk factors for suspected suicide? So what they've done is they've looked at each and every one of those 114 suicides where someone had been living with experiencing domestic abuse. And they've looked at the cluster of the most common risk factors. Now, this is really important to inform anyone that you're working with, anyone who you're thinking of referring to MARIC, and also anyone where we are assuming that the major risk is a physical injury or even death, but not necessarily suicide. So looking at all those cases, these are the top 10 most important factors, which will have definite implications for how we practice. So again, what questions are we asking ourselves as a consequence of knowing this? So the first and most significant finding was that the perpetrator was known to police for domestic abuse in another relationship. This fundamentally, for me, goes back to the comment and Craig's really helpful presentation on Clare's Law. So, and it also talks about manipulation, but I'll mention more about that in a minute. So the perpetrator did all this to somebody else before they met you. And I think we know about how people use manipulation. If you change, then I wouldn't be violent. If you hadn't pushed all my buttons, if you hadn't have done this, if you loved me more, if you did whatever it takes, then I wouldn't be violent. Is a critical part of the modus operandi. But if we look at people who go on to kill themselves, the most common factor is that that person was abusive in a previous relationship. So I think that's something to work with. The next is that they have used coercive and controlling behaviors. So again, well, if you love me, you take the tablets. It's counterintuitive to me. I still can't get my head around that. But that is what a perpetrator was telling someone. They were trying to beseech them to kill themselves. The perpetrator has problems with alcohol. The perpetrator has used non-fatal strangulation. It's not only just an assault in its own right, it is also incredibly controlling. And I'll talk a little bit more about non-fatal strangulation in a minute. It's not just about sustaining physical injuries. And the perpetrator misuses drugs. So they're the top 10. Carrying on, sorry, with number 6, the perpetrator has mental health problems themselves. Now, obviously, that needs to be recognized in ensuring that the individual has the appropriate helps and supports in place. But equally, there is evidence that people are using their mental health problems to try and provide themselves with an excuse or some victim identification. So that can also be used manipulatively. The relationship ending increases risk. So again, something to be aware of. And we've got some cases in Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, and the risks did go up when the relationship ended. And in 2 of our suicide cases, they killed themselves then. And there's questions about, I'm never going to be free of them, because even though I've ended the relationship, they're still stalking, they're still harassing me, and they're still involved in malicious communication. So I'm never going to be rid of them. So that's a time when the risk of murder increases, but also the risk of suicide, because they feel that even after going to this extent, I'm still not free of him. So the perpetrator has experienced depression and anxiety, and the researchers distinguish that from other mental health problems. The perpetrator has previously been suicidal themselves. And again, people feeling, I can't leave him, I can't do anything that will make him more likely to kill themselves. So it puts more pressure on that individual because they feel there's less opportunities to leave. And then finally, the perpetrator has also experienced domestic abuse themselves. So they actually found 23 common factors, but these 10 are the most prevalent. So something to be thinking about in terms of managing risks and to use that information dynamically when you're supporting somebody, I think. So non-fatal strangulation. So it's been recognized as a crime in its own right under Section 70 of the Domestic Abuse Act. And the reason being because it's not just a form of assault, it also creates an overwhelming level of fear and control. When it's prevalent in relationships, if you look at the DASH forms, so the domestic abuse, stalking, honor-based violence, risk assessment and referral into MARIC form, it asks specific questions about non-fatal strangulation because it increases the risks if somebody is involved in those behaviours. And 44% of victims reported having been strangled previously. So isn't that interesting? Strangulation was used in nearly half of those cases. And in sexual violence, 1 in 11 adults reporting a rape describe strangulation as part of the attack. But if the person who raped you was known to you, was a partner, an ex-partner, that goes up to 1 in 5. So what does that tell us about the mechanism of non-fatal strangulation in those relationships? I've sent the links to the documents that I've used, but I just thought I'd also share the top 5 risk factors of perpetrators in homicides. So not the suspected suicide ones. These are the figures for partner homicides. So for partner homicides, top 5 risk factors. The perpetrator was previously known to the police for domestic abuse, so very similar. The perpetrator has mental health problems. There's been a history of coercive and controlling behavior in the relationship, and then again, alcohol and drugs feature large. For family member homicides, so being killed by a sibling or by a parent or adult child, mental illness is the most critical factor in that. Previously known to the police for domestic abuse is also a feature. Other mental health problems, and the distinction they make is between forms of psychosis as mental illness, and then anxiety, depression is categorized as the other mental health problems. And then again, drug and alcohol problems of the perpetrator also looms large there. So signs of domestic abuse, well, emotional, and I deliberately start with emotional, the belittling, the blaming, the isolating, the demanding, the accusations, controlling what people were, controlling how they spend their money, how they spend their time, what their thoughts are, denials, and gaslighting. Gaslighting is actually used in the Domestic Abuse Act statutory guidance, where people, because there is a phenomenon that's been going on as long as domestic abuse has, where the perpetrator tries to make the other person, the victim or the survivor, feel it's their fault, that they're going mad, that there's something wrong with them. So the perpetrator doesn't have to own their violence. And then the threats, but it's not just threats to the person, but it's also threats to destroy things. I'll kill your horse, I'll kill your dog, I'll kill your family, are really, really important with those. And then physical signs, which we're aware of in terms of assault, but again, highlighting the non-fatal strangulation. And then sexual as well features large in those signs of domestic abuse. So if you want some more local information about domestic abuse in Telford and or Shropshire, there's a hyperlink that will take you to all of the details, including how to access the DASH form, so the domestic abuse, stalking, honor-based violence, risk assessment and referral into MARIC if you're not a police officer. So you can get links to those documents by going on the websites there. And to try and summarize my whole presentation in one slide, this is a 7-minute briefing. So what domestic homicides are, why they are important, that link between we really do recognise that we need to think more about the risk of suicide as a consequence of domestic abuse, and then focusing on the 10 highest risk factors. If you see the hyperlink at the bottom, you'll have all 23 listed there. Particular emphasis on coercive and controlling behaviours, because the isolation is critical to that. The it's your fault, not mine is elements. So more information about coercive and controlling behaviour. Help and support, and where that's available, again from the hyperlinks, and things that you need to think about. So we've talked about being professionally curious, being person-centered and persistent at the same time. They don't want any help. They've denied it's an issue. Having those conversations, going back when you're seeing that individual the next time and talking to them again. Have you got flags on your system to know that this person has been experiencing domestic abuse in the relationship? So when they're re-referred, you can ask the questions about that then. And then the other factors to think about as well in terms of the non-suicide part of domestic abuse. So hopefully that has been a whistle-stop tour, and we can take any questions, but I'm mindful we've got Cranston to come as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. Another excellent information-packed presentation, delivered on time. We're doing very well today. And again, if we do have time at the end, we will take questions, though I think everybody recognises now, we know the people involved. And if you can't ask the questions now, plenty of opportunity outside the meeting. So without further ado, hand over to Don Jones from Cranston, who's going to talk about their service, talking also about warning flags, and perhaps introduce Cranston to us, as they're quite new on the scene, and very welcome. So Don, over to you.
Right, thank you very much. My name's Dan Jones. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you guys see that?
Yeah,
yes,
right.
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I'm Dan Jones, the team lead for the violent prevention practitioners and the Men and Masculinities programme in Telford. My colleague here. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Liz Bowden, and I'm the team lead for the Victim Support Services and the Young People Service. Lovely to be here this afternoon.
Right.
So I'm obviously, as you said, we're pretty new on the scene. So I think Maria Cripps was at your June lunchtime lunch and learn. So it gives me an opportunity today as operational manager to sort of just give everybody sort of a bit of an update of what we've been up to since June. Obviously, we're working in close partnership with West Mercia's Women's Aid, and single point of contact via the phone or inbox at West Mercia Women's Aid. I run the team that provide the outreach provision. So obviously, if it's been through Women's Aid, and the safety is now in place, it can come through to us for the longer term practical support, but also then ongoing recovery work. We have different programs. We currently have the Freedom Project running at full capacity in our office, and we're due to run out the new provision, The Voice, in the beginning of the new year. We still have our coffee mornings that are run on a weekly basis, and the next thing on the to-do list is looking at the one-stop shop. So there will be a place where people can come and get that expert advice in the one place. So that will be the next thing to deliver on. We also obviously find safe accommodation for people wanting to flee domestic abuse, whether that be in the same area or moving out of the area, and we do that, and obviously to support that safety for that person fleeing domestic abuse. Also on the side of that, to update you all on our Children and Young People's service, we offer outreach one-to-one service for children that have been impacted domestic abuse from the age of 5 to 16-year-olds. We are currently, happily to say, we're currently in 16 schools now. Our young people outreach worker is extremely busy, delivering a specialist 8 weeks victim programme that looks at building the resilience, the safety planning, grounding techniques, sort of impulse control, but also sort of understanding and unpicking their lived experience and their day-to-day lives and how they can manage that and keep themselves safe. So like I say, that's we're very busy in that side of the service, which is excellent because we're getting to those young people. We have done some work with them about how they want to find our information, because we talked to them about different communications and leaflets, and what they're saying to us is they'd like us to actually just go into their schools and attend assemblies and sort of workshops. So that's what we're going to be looking at doing going forward. And also we would like to talk at inset training, teacher training days on if they want consultations, if they want some advice and further training. So that's where we are with our Children and Young People's service. I think it's back over to you, Dan, about the male masculinities.
Yeah, so our perpetrator offer, we do male masculinities. It's a 24-week group work program. It's mainly working with male on female violence. It's a running program, which is Respect accredited. It's got an attached partner support service to make sure both parties collaborating well, so we can keep the victims safe and assess the risk on an ongoing scale. We're trying not to escalate the risk throughout the course, so we're making sure that the victim or survivors feel supported throughout the perpetrator program. If that's the case, we discuss loads of different things during the course, such as coercive control, sexual violence, how they manage their behaviour during relationships, and various loads of topics through. We also accommodate for various different scenarios. So we also offer like a 16-week course for people that have got neurodiversity issues, that can't sit still in a room, or LGBT community, and of course, they're going to need something differently, as well as female perpetrators. And we can do that on a one-to-one basis. And we also accommodate for non-English first language. So we'd get an interpreter in to speak to them and then try and get that across on a cultural level as well. We're happy to do consultations with any referrer to let them know how we're getting on or how they're getting on, as that's really important that they know what service we're providing and where they've got to throughout the rolling programme. So that should bring us on to back to you, Liz.
Yeah, so we'll just talk you through a little bit of sort of the added value of working in partnership with Women's Aid. We have a robust developed partnership with them, and linking closely with their IDFA service and their young persons IDFA. We also offer free of charge for training modules that cover the basics of domestic abuse awareness. We also offer the perpetrator training for professionals, because sometimes that can be where practitioners struggle a little bit about where to start with questioning if somebody is a perpetrator of abuse or not. We also do training for supporting victims and survivors, and another one on the impact and effect on young children and young people. But if people want to know anything more about that, obviously our details will be left along with our presentation going forward. We obviously, as a new service, the staff that were two-paid across to us are still with us, so that's kept things consistent with victims and survivors. We're also, along with Women's Aid, the national lead in domestic abuse sector, and have led on lots of different initiatives around the country. Dan's Male and Masculinities programme, that's Respect accredited, And an update from the last meeting, we now have a male advert in post with me, Paul Whitehead, who is working on all levels, risk levels of male victims within Telford and Wrekin. So it's new and it's exciting. So that's fantastic. So that person's in post now. I think on the next one, Dan, it's just our contact details and our main email address. So if everything comes into here, whether it's for a victim, perpetrator, children, young peoples, if it comes to that tw@cranston.org.uk, it'll get to us and we will obviously make sure it's triaged into the right part of our service. So that's the place to get the referrals into. Also, I know with obviously previous presenters, we've talked a lot about domestic abuse and the definitions, but I've been asked to do a whistle-top tour on the definition of domestic abuse. And obviously there was only a legal definition since the Domestic Abuse Act, and that definition is any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive and threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over, or who are and have an intimate partner or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. And this can encompass, but is not limited to, the following types: of psychological, physical, sexual, economic and emotional. And that's just the slight change within the DA Act, that it's not financial anymore, it's moved on to economics. And obviously the more definitions around coercive control and what that actually means. So it's got a controlling behaviour is a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, depriving them of the means needed for independence, resistance and escape, and regulating their everyday behaviour. And those can be really small changes, small things that are asked of people to do, that it's that drip effect over many years, where there may never have been a physical incident, but it's really about unpicking those small changes in behaviours, and particularly in the perpetrator work. What are they actually doing in that relationship that is coercive and controlling? As I say, coercive behaviour is an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation and intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish or frighten their victim. This definition, which is not a legal definition, includes so-called honour-based violence, female genital mutilation and forced marriage, and is clear that victims are not confined to one gender or ethnic group. And just a little bit on that, on the gender-based abuse, obviously we saw in the statistics in the previous presentation, gender-based violence is violence that is directed against a person on the basis of their gender. Since gender-based violence is mostly inflicted by men on women and girls, it is often used interchangeably with the term violence against women and girls in vogue. And this can include domestic violence, physical, sexual, financial, emotional or psychological abuse, rape and sexual assault. And that, it always blows my mind that it wasn't illegal until 1991, where there was sexual assault or rape in a marriage. That's not that long ago. Obviously stalking, prostitution, sex work, sexual exploitation, trafficking or sexual exploitation, FGM, forced marriage and so-called honour-based violence. I think Dan's going to go through the different
types. So that brings us on to different types of abuse. So we've got physical, which is punching, kicking, slapping or beating, pinching, pushing or pulling, holding a person captive, not allowing them to leave, use of weapons and thrown objects. Thrown objects is in there because people tend to think of it as like a knife or a gun, but also throwing a cup across the room or an object at somebody needs to be classed as a weapon as well. Pinning somebody down, refusing to help when you're injured or sick, withholding medications, medical treatment, choking, strangulation, drowning or suffocating a person. So that brings on to psychological and emotional, making somebody feel guilty about spending time with somebody else, isolating a person, putting somebody down, insulting and criticising them, blaming somebody for everything, making somebody feel as though they cannot do anything right, telling someone that no one wants them and they are lucky to have them, gaslighting, intimidation and control, and withholding affection as a punishment. Sexual abuse, forcing someone to do anything sexual that they are not comfortable with. This is rape or sexual assault. Preventing somebody from using birth control or contraception, forcing someone to participate in prostitution or pornography, video, sexual acts, and sharing it without somebody's permission, which is really common in younger communities nowadays. Unwanted touching, and controlling a decision about abortion/pregnancy. Economics, another type of abuse, controlling or taking somebody's money, not allowing somebody to have a job, not including somebody in the family, financial decisions, making fun of somebody's financial contribution, saying they're not worth anything, not allowing someone to talk to anyone about their finances, demanding an account of everything somebody buys. There was a case that one of the people that we worked with, they'd get receipts for every time they went out and bought anything, and then would have to show the perpetrator what they were buying. Obtaining credit in a person's name or accruing debt.
And in addition to this, intersectionality and previous types of abuse, obviously the cultural aspect and honour-based and FGM, but also male victims, stigma, obviously, that's around male victims accessing support and the barriers to that. And like I say, having a male IDVA is a move towards that, which in the right direction. Obviously, the LGBTQ community and the different needs within those relationships and understanding that. Men that have sex with men, so they could be married, heterosexual marriage with children, but go on a weekend and have sex with men, they're the most unlikely to come and access support if things have happened to them, because they're living a secret life to a certain degree. Substance misuse, where that is not a reason for abuse, but it can escalate within a relationship if substance misuse is in play. And children and young people, and the impact and the effect it has on living in an environment where there's domestic abuse, having lifelong effects and trauma. Moving on to the trauma-informed practice, and about how we work with victims and survivors, about how many times they've had to tell their story, how we expect our victim survivors just to speak on a phone to a complete stranger, fill a dash in or a dar or whatever, answer very, very sensitive and scary questions. So making sure they feel safe to be able to do that, that you believe what they're saying to them, making sure that the environment you're expecting them to have these conversations with is understood. Have they got the children at home? What is the place confidential where they're able to speak to you? Going forward, what barriers are in the way. We have to be more creative with how we speak to our victim survivors, for them to be able to share their information with us. Is there language barriers, the use of language line and the correct and appropriate interpreters, understanding what we're asking of them, what the question's asking, and asking, like Paul said previously, asking the right questions at the right time, to elicit, their safety and how they want to recover moving forward, is really, really important. Also, as professionals, just other signs that may indicate there could be something happening for that person. So it can be injuries to the person who's actually being abusive. There's a case recently where they had cuts and a sort of a ripped t-shirt, and there was counter allegations about who was the abusive person in that intimate relationship. But it turns out that those injuries occurred because she was being dragged down the stairs by her hair. So it's about who's doing what to whom and unpicking that a little bit further when presented with that information. like I say, it's substance misuse. You know, if there's chaotic behaviour happening, that can be a sign. Also looking at in sort of housing associations, the damage to properties. Some training was done by Cranston about, you know, broken windows, holes in the doors, punches in the doors. So obviously not so that they're experts in domestic abuse, but that they have an awareness of what properties could look like. Obviously, have they previously sought anger management? That is not the correct service for an abusive person, because they use their anger very carefully to certain people. So they don't need anger management, but they may have seemed to have been involved in anger management previously. Couples counselling, like I say, not correct services for abusive behaviour. However, there could be that kind of history there. And frequent separations and reconciliations, that's another thing to sort of look out when you're working with people. I think our details are on next. Dan, is that correct?
Yeah, that's great. Sorry about the internet connection. I'm hotspotting, so it's gone down a couple of times.
And that's it from me and Dan. So if there's any questions?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dan and Liz. Again, a very comprehensive and detailed presentation. We have got 10 minutes before the timed end. I've just been checking through the chat, and there seems to be most of the questions asked in the chat have already been answered. So does anybody have any specific questions they want to raise to the four speakers? If you can raise your hand in the time-honoured electronic form. You can't say yes, okay. Aisha.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask, work part tend to use resolve to refer other people that experience abuse. Can I just
pause you, Aisha, for a second? So I think somebody else has got their microphone on and we're getting cross. So can you turn everyone except Aisha, turn their mics off, please?
Aisha, is it your office that the background noise is coming from?
Oh, it might be. Actually, sorry. Yeah, it is.
I don't know if you could shout then, just to shout over those people. Sorry.
Yeah, can you hear me okay now?
Yes, that's fine.
That's better.
Thanks.
So I work for the crisis team for CAMS, Children and Young People in Telford, cover quite a large area. So we refer to what we call Resolve, which is children that have experienced domestic abuse and violence. And Liz, you mentioned that you offer outreach. I was just wondering, as another kind of service that we could utilise, how we would refer into your service for our young people.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you make the referral through the TW at Cranston, we'll put it in the chat for you.
Okay.
Dan might be able to put that in the chat for you now.
Lovely.
But yeah, we've kept the referral as simple as possible. So you've got a victim tick, a perpetrator tick, or a children and young people's tick that, put your information and pop it through to that general email address, and we'll pick it up from there.
Lovely.
Then we'll have a consultation with you. That's brilliant, though.
Oh, lovely. Thanks very much. And I'll pass it on to the team. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? I can't see. Okay. Well, I think everyone's got the contact details of the speakers anyway. So if they have any further questions, they can raise them. So we're a few minutes early, but it's always good to get off early. So first of all, I'd like to thank all the contributors. I think we've all learnt an enormous amount about domestic abuse, and the end result of that can only be that we address it in a more professional way, and that will benefit the victims. So thank you all for making that contribution. So thank you, Craig, Paul, Dan and Liz. And thank you particularly to Lisa, who has organised this. Very successful, first of 3 this week. So unless anybody has anything else they'd like to ask, no, or I'd like to say, thank you all for attending. Great session. Thanks to the presenters. Thank you to Lisa. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you very much, all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.